Ukraine 1943, a game published by GMT, a war game obviously. The title already tells you where and when the action takes place, but if you have any doubt, here the subtitle tells you the Soviet summer offensive against Army Group South. So we're in the Barbarossa campaign, and if you're tired of Barbarossa games where the Germans are on the attack, well, this is the game for you, because this is a game about when the Soviets are pushing back. In this game, the defenders are the Germans. The Germans are outnumbered. They're still pretty strong though. They outgun the Soviets in most cases, but the Soviets vastly outnumber the Germans. So this is the trade-off right there. So it's a two-player game, Germans versus Soviets. Germans are defending and trying not to give up terrain, and the Soviets are pushing and pushing and pushing and trying to take control of as much ground as possible. Two-player game, but also perfectly solitaire friendly because there is no hidden information, so you can play the game playing both sides by yourself to the best of your possibilities. What I have here, what I played and what I'm reviewing today is not the first edition of the game. This is the second edition. The first one came out a couple of years ago. I haven't played the first edition, but from what I read in the rulebook, it appears that this is far from just a reprint edition. This is an edition that has been streamlined. Again, I have not played the previous edition. I'm simply relying on what the rulebook says. I don't think they're lying. I don't see the point in that. So it appears that the game is now considerably simpler, more accessible, streamlined overall. And I can tell you already that while this may be simpler than the game was before, it still packs quite a good punch when it comes to historical detail. There's still a lot of chrome and a lot of historical detail here. I don't know what was changed in the procedures, and maybe there was even more chrome before. I cannot say that, but what I can say is that here there's still definitely a good, rewarding amount of historical chrome. Now, let me tell you about the game. The game comes with two paper maps that you will place adjacent to one another, actually with a little bit of an overlapping, to represent the overall area of the conflict, the overall area of operations. Then you set up the game based on the scenario instructions, so the scenario that you have decided to play. But generally speaking, you will have a line of German units that are trying to defend, that are trying to prevent the Russians from pushing them too far back towards the side of the map, and you have the Russians on the other hand forming a line and pushing against the Germans. So for the Germans it will be a matter of figuring out ways of delaying the Soviets as soon as possible, moving people in the back and form fortifications while other people are holding the front, and then move and repeat. Try to figure out a way of slowing down gradually the advance of the Soviets. If you're playing the campaign game, then the initial lines, the German line and the Soviet line, will run around this area here. You see a red line there to give you a sense of where the Soviets and the Germans are at the beginning. If you're playing the campaign game, with some other German units scattered around here, but the majority of the units of the German player will be holding the front, and all of the Soviet units will be lined up on the other side of the front. Units in this game are represented by these counters here, with a symbol identifying the type of unit in the middle of the counter, and then three stats printed at the bottom, respectively attack factor, defense factor, and movement factor, movement points. Also, the units may have other symbols, colors behind the numbers to indicate special capabilities, to indicate the quality of the troop. There are a lot of variations based on possible other ways that will modify the way in which the units behave. You have artillery units that are flipped to their use side once you use them to support an attack. And you also have counters, special counter indicating commanders, representing commanders. We have Manstein here, and these special counters representing leaders can lend benefits to the units within range that they are supporting. For example, they can lend die rerolls to attacks in which the units of that side are involved. Now, each turn starts with a weather phase when you determine the weather for the turn, and that will affect certain conditions on the board, such as use of secondary roads. Then the main part of the turn is divided in two players' turns. So first you have a Soviet player turn and then a German player turn. Each player's turn has an initial phase in which the active player will receive reinforcements as dictated by the schedule on the turn track, replacements which can be used to restore units that have been reduced or that have been eliminated, and also the active player can flip up to 3 used artillery units back to their fresh side. Then you have a movement phase where units of the active player move, and you also have then a combat phase when units that are adjacent to enemy units can attack. Pretty basic, really. And after combat, you have supply. You have to check that your units are in supply, that they can draw a line of supply back to a supply source. And important for this reason are railroads that of course are great supply sources, but for the Soviet player some of these railroads are not fully built at the beginning of the game. One of the things that add crown to the design, one of the circle details, is that as the Soviet player you will rebuild your railroads as you go. As you're clearing the area from German units and you're pushing them back, you're also building, rebuilding or building railroads behind you. Now, movement. You move your units up to their full movement allowance, and that's it. The movement allowance is modified depending on the terrain that you're entering and the borders that you're crossing. Enemy units project zones of control. You have to stop when you enter a zone of control. And similarly to what you have in other designs by this designer, Simonich, there is a concept of bond, the bond between zones of control. That is, two enemy units that have an intervening hex or an intervening hex side form a bond that an enemy unit cannot enter. So an enemy unit will not be able to enter this hex here because there's a bond between that unit there and this unit here, and also the unit would not be able, enemy unit would not be able to cross this hex side here. Which is important, especially for the German player. Such a thing is important for the defender, because the defender has to play around with the zones of control and with the bonds a little bit to slow down the advance of the opponent. But this is an extremely important element in the design. So you move, and movement may be affected by terrain and by zones of control. Then, as I said, you have combat. But actually during movement there are also not a couple of wrinkles. For example, you can have overrun. These are called automatic defender shatter situations. If when moving you are piling up a number of attack points that are 10 times or more than the number of the defender you're adjacent to, then the defender automatically is shattered and has to withdraw. It's the way in which this game handles what in other games is called overrunning. Also, it is during this phase here, the movement phase, that the active player can build fortifications, so adding fortification markers to the board, and also the active player can use railroad movement. Then, as I said, you have combat. Now, combat is pretty basic, is really old school. You simply total the number of attack points that the attacker has mustered against a single enemy hex, and then you total the number of defense points the defender has. You divide the number of attack points by the number of defense points. You turn that into a ratio that will determine the column that will be used when you're resolving combat on the combat table. However, there are situations that will provide modifications. For example, there may be situations that will provide shifts. If the players are committing air support, there is a marker that you can commit to a combat, then that may give a shift to the right or to the left, depending on the side that it is using that. There are other modifications that are based on terrain, such as, for example, here, when the defender is in a minor city or a major city, the defender factor is doubled. When the defender is in a marsh, the defender is doubled and the attacker is halved. But when attacking out of With a major river, defender is double, attacker halved when attacking across, things like that. Fortifications, you have one shift to the left on the combat table, and you have an extra check to indicate extra casualties that maybe have to be absorbed by the attacker. So you simply total attack points, divide by defense points, apply modifiers, find the right column, roll a die, cross-reference the result of your d6 with the column that you found, and then you read the result, which will be indicated by these letters here, and then you have the here the explanation of the combat results. DS means defender shatters, pretty bad. DRM, the defender retreats, the attacker receives a bonus advance, defender loses one step. Defender loses one step, may have to retreat. Each side loses one step. This kind of thing, exchange, etc., etc., etc. Something that's important is that a lot of combat results will result in a possible retreat from the defender. The defender may try to cancel that by applying the determined defense rule. Only in some cases, in case of some defenses, then the defender may try to roll on the stable. The column that is used to resolve the attempt to resist is based on the terrain in which the defender is situated, and then you simply read the result, which may be that the retreat is indeed cancelled, and or losses may have to be taken by one side or by both sides. So there's that. Something interesting is that retreat is not a fixed number of X's. The amount of number of X's that the defender may have to retreat as a consequence of an attack depends on the type of result from the combat table, and then the attacker may move, and the attacker, as moving, as advancing after combat, may also be able to pursue other attacks, to pursue further attacks while advancing after combat, which is particularly important for the Soviet players. The Soviet player is trying to keep up momentum, to keep pushing the Germans back towards the western side of the board, and try to keep the Germans out of balance to prevent them from reforming or from forming powerful groups. Another important element in the game is stacking limits. They are pretty tough for the Soviet player. The Soviet player doesn't have great attack values in the case of many of their units. On top of that, their stacking limit is of 2 units per hex, plus some special units that can stack for free. And also there are some special units that count as headquarters, and those also will allow you to have an extra unit stacked. But the standard is 2. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it may be 4, but it still means that the Soviet player has to do some maneuvering around the German units before he can put together a total of attack points that will make the attack worth it. As you can see, some locations on the map have numbers printed on them. That's the number of victory points that the location is worth. The Soviet player scores those points by occupying those locations, that is effectively by freeing those locations from the German occupants. And there's a certain number of fluctuating victory points that changes throughout the game based on numbers printed on the turn track. And if the Soviet player manages to go past a certain number of points, to score highest of the number of points by a certain turn, then the Soviet player wins automatic victory. If the level of victory of points that are scored by occupying cities is not high enough, based on the numbers printed on the turn track, then actually the Soviet player may suffer an automatic defeat. If not, you play until the end of the scenario, and then you look at the number of points scored by the Soviet player to determine who won and who lost the scenario. This is a game by Mark Simonich, and I can see the similarities between this game and other games by this designer that I played in the past, in particular the Caucasus Campaign. Concepts such as troop quality, which may affect combat odds, concepts such as also control bonds, those are things that I'd seen in that other design. Another design, the Caucasus Campaign, I also really enjoyed because I found that it had a very good mix of historical detail, chrome, depth, while still fully playable without becoming cumbersome at all. The same thing I found here. I don't know if the previous edition maybe was too cumbersome in terms of procedures, but this one, while maybe not the friendliest game to a newbie wargamer, not probably a beginner's wargamer, is far from being a particular advanced one. I would say, I don't know, 200 level class of wargaming. You took Wargaming 101 and now it's time to enroll in 222. There's second year wargaming, which means mechanically the game is not difficult at all. It's very basic, it's very classic. If anything, you see a little bit of nostalgia there. When I see a combat table based on odds, I don't know, I just think of the good old days when I was too young to play, by the way. I'm kind of like reminiscing about an age, the golden age of wargaming that I never really experienced because I was too young. I'm playing the old games now, or games based on some old time-tested mechanics. And the combat odds mechanic is one that works very well. Here you don't get to numbers where you will need the calculator. So you have that classic feel to it, very simple, very streamlined core of procedures, weather, reinforcements, replacements, move, combat, supply. That's pretty much it when it comes to the bones of the skeleton of the design. But then there's a lot of flesh and a lot of other things around that. What makes the game not entirely friendly to the beginners wargamer is the level of little historical details that have been packed and hardwired around the design, from building railroads, all the things that you need to take into account when you're calculating the odds. Certain units will give you a bonus for having armor if you have armor and the opponent doesn't have armor, but then some units will deny the armor advantage without giving you an advantage. This kind of thing, this kind of details here may be a little overwhelming for new players, but if you're a semi-seasoned wargamer, then you will appreciate those. You will really see them as a bonus, not as a limitation, not as an hindrance to play, to enjoying the gameplay. That's really not, it's not that detailed that the game becomes like a textbook and becomes too procedural. So I really enjoy playing this game because it had a nice chrome, nice historical flavor, a deep sense of immersion while still remaining playable, remaining manageable. The amount of rules and procedures that you had to take into account as you play the game were not overwhelming. Many of those rules do not apply from turn 1. So if you're playing the campaign game, you just read the rulebook, you see, oh, this applies from turn 8, I'll just make a note and I'll go and read that rule carefully and worry about it when the time comes. So the game is not hard to play. It has a really nice flow. Now, like several games that start with a long front that is already settled on the map, the first turn or two may not be too exciting, especially if you're playing the campaign game. Then players are already sitting there by one another. Now, setting up can be pretty interesting for the Soviet player. The Soviet player gets to see what the Germans do, and then the Soviet player can organize things to try and experiment with different types of setup. But the first couple of turns will be just punching the Germans. There isn't really anything else. The Soviet player at the beginning is trying to dislodge the Germans from their fortified locations, and that's tough, which means the first couple of turns may not be too exciting, especially, I guess, if you're playing a two-player game, as the German player are just sitting there and waiting for a lot of attacks to be resolved, and then you maybe get to move a unit, you move it back, so you start building a fortification, you're holding the line, and then the Soviet player again plays forever as he's launching attacks all across the line. It's necessary evil, so to speak, because this is the theme. If you want to experience this kind of topic, that is how it works. But I'm just saying that the exciting part of the action is not at the beginning. The exciting part of the action is to see how much damage the Soviet player inflicted in the first couple of turns. Then things become dynamic and full of tough, tense decisions for both sides, because the Soviet player is trying to maneuver to concentrate enough strength to deliver powerful punches against the German Soviet player is trying to keep the Germans off balance, scattered around the map, disrupted. The Soviet player needs to keep up momentum, and of course the German player has to prevent the opponent from doing precisely so. The German player needs to find a good balance between retreating and holding ground. Either of them is done too much by the German player, things are not going to be easy for the German player. The German player really needs to move somebody back, prepare, find good positions, leave somebody in the front to slow down the Soviets, repeat and alternate. So there are decisions for both sides. While the game is not asymmetrical mechanically, because the two players' turns are virtually identical, it is pretty asymmetrical when it comes to the experience of the players, how the players need to face the challenges, the terrain, the mission, and the overall situation imposes on them. So, Ukraine 43, I don't know if you picked up the previous edition, I don't know if this one will have enough differences for you, in case you already own the first edition. I don't know if this one will be attractive to you, but I know that without having played the first one, I definitely enjoyed this one. I find it to be an historically detailed, yet fully playable and highly rewarding wargame, and definitely I would recommend it to anybody who is interested in serious wargaming and in the topic depicted in this game.